Thank you very much to Lee Young-Wan and the Korea Science Journalists Association for inviting me to speak with you today. And thanks to all of you who are watching. It's a pleasure to be here. I'm Siri Carpenter, and I'm a science journalist and editor in the United States. I'm also co-founder and editor of the Open Notebook, which is a nonprofit organization whose mission is to help science journalists improve their skills. We do that through articles on the craft of science writing, and we also published our first book last year, The Craft of Science Writing. Today, I'd like to share some observations with you about some of the challenges of covering the coronavirus pandemic in the US, and about how US science journalists are trying to meet those challenges. I'll begin by mentioning something that certainly isn't unique to the US, which is the dizzying pace of scientific research on COVID. This makes for an incredibly fast-changing news landscape, and it can be a breeding ground for confusion and uncertainty. For journalists, one particular issue that this has presented is the question of when and how to cover preprint manuscripts or scientific papers that haven't yet undergone peer review. The number of preprints in the biological sciences has increased dramatically in the last few years, and the pandemic has further heightened the number and the prominence of preprints. So how can reporters write about research that hasn't yet undergone a full scientific vetting? For journalists, the challenge is to decide on a case-by-case basis whether to cover a preprint manuscript, which is a matter of weighing what the risks versus the potential benefits of doing so are. And then if they do decide to cover a preprint, to be extra skeptical of its claims and to vet it with even more independent scientists than they might otherwise. The consequences of being too quick to cover a preprint without giving it a proper vetting and providing appropriate context for the findings can be particularly damaging where a new research finding seems at least superficially to be alarming. That was the case, for example, with a preprint posted last spring that led to sensationalized news stories about how the virus was mutating. This was a story that caused a lot of unnecessary alarm and was a distraction from other stories. One of the most important underlying issues to recognize and address in any conversation about the pandemic in the US is the way in which racial disparities in healthcare have been worsened by COVID-19. Black, Indigenous, and Latinx people in the United States are more likely to be exposed to the virus because they're more likely to work in essential jobs. They're less likely to have access to testing and good quality healthcare. They're more likely to live in crowded housing conditions, and they're more likely to have underlying illnesses that tend to make the outcomes of getting COVID worse. It's critically important that journalists shine light on these disparities and on the disproportionate effects that the pandemic is having on communities of color and other marginalized groups. We need to focus our lens on the systemic inequalities that fuel those disparities, as well as on the experiences and expertise that these communities bring and the sources of resilience that they draw on. Some reporters have been tackling this by doing data journalism pieces on the extent of the problem. Others have used the story of a particular patient to illuminate the toll of the virus on marginalized communities. These stories are an extremely important part of coronavirus reporting in the US. One of the most important roles that all science journalists play is telling stories using data, finding ways to put numbers in context that is meaningful and informative for readers. The hard part is that we can't just show people a lot of undigested numbers and expect them to know what they should take away from those numbers or how those data should guide their decisions, because people can only take in so much information. I think about how overwhelming the numbers are when I open up my own county's COVID-19 dashboard and see so many different metrics. I have all these data at my fingertips about new cases and percent positives and total cases and hospitalizations and deaths. And all of those are broken down by race and gender and age. But it's really hard to know what to make of all of those numbers in their raw form or how to use them to make decisions. For example, right now, the COVID numbers in my state of Wisconsin are among the worst in the United States. We're really in a severe crisis here. Every day I look at that data dashboard and I kind of grimace and I worry But the numbers don't answer a fundamental question like, is it okay for me to go for a walk with a friend right now? Or can I hug my daughter when she comes home from college for the holidays? Here in the US, our political leaders are not helping us make these kinds of decisions in any kind of reliable or cogent way. So we're very dependent on journalism. And that's why we as journalists have to help people understand what to make of the data by looking for patterns that tell a meaningful story and that enable people to make decisions. And that's been a difficult thing to do sometimes here because the COVID data in the US are frankly a mess. It's not possible to rely on our state or federal governments to provide accurate information. One very important response to that problem has been the creation of the COVID Tracking Project. This is a volunteer effort created by journalists at The Atlantic last March to collect and standardize data on COVID testing and patient outcomes from every US state every day and to put the data into context. Journalists all over the US use the COVID Tracking Project tools as a way to track and show their readers what is really happening, since the federal government is not doing so effectively. The problems with tracking data in the US are related to another particularly acute challenge for US science journalists, which is that virtually everything about this pandemic has been politicized in the US. That includes questions about where the virus came from, how it jumped to humans, how it spreads from person to person, how lethal it is, what people should do to protect themselves, who is most vulnerable, how we should test for and treat the virus, and how we should develop and approve and disseminate a vaccine when one is available. We're in a situation in which simply acknowledging facts or providing basic public health information is treated as a political and partisan act. And that's something that I think US reporters and editors are still grappling with how to deal with. The politicization of the pandemic has done a huge amount of harm to the public. First, because it's created a lot of confusion and uncertainty. And as I've said, people simply don't know where to turn for information that they can trust. That has meant that the role of journalism has been more critical than ever in the US. But at the same time, the politicization of the virus has also significantly interfered with journalists' efforts to cover the pandemic. One critical way in which that's true is that there's been very poor or inconsistent access to information, especially from scientists at federal agencies. That's a really central problem facing US journalists who've discovered that they're not able to count on the sources who they've traditionally been able to count on. Probably the most prominent example of that is at the US Centers for Disease Control and Prevention. The CDC has historically led the US public health community in managing infectious disease outbreaks and in planning for how to respond to pandemic scenarios. But the extreme degree to which the Trump administration has chosen to politicize the pandemic and to muzzle its scientific experts has meant that journalists have had to rely much more on leaked documents than on the expert sources that they've traditionally relied on and have built relationships with. One of the best stories I've read about what's gone wrong at the CDC was published just a couple of weeks ago by ProPublica. That piece, titled "Inside the Fall of the CDC," provides grim details about the havoc that political interference has caused at this critically important public institution. The issue of the reliability of information more broadly has been a continuous journalistic challenge throughout the pandemic. We've seen a truly incredible proliferation of misinformation and of dangerous conspiracy theories. And this problem has been exacerbated by the President of the United States and his surrogates and allies. What that has meant for journalists, first, is that they're forced to repeatedly decide whether to report on the latest piece of misinformation, whether debunking misinformation in this case will help or will only amplify fringe views, and whether debunking misinformation is a good use of their time and of the limited space in their publication. In addition to dealing with flat-out misinformation, US journalists also have to be prepared to respond quickly to government announcements that may reflect underlying agendas. In the current environment, it's more important than ever to provide factual and contextualized information quickly. As one example, The US Food and Drug Administration has just approved the drug remdesivir, despite a large WHO trial suggesting there was little to no benefit of this treatment. Many US journalists who've been reporting carefully throughout the pandemic were able to respond with nuanced stories that pointed out the WHO results and that included skeptical voices in discussions about the approval process. Finally, a really important role that science journalists covering the pandemic need to play is in communicating the nature of science. A defining aspect of the pandemic in the US has been the profound distrust that many people have when it comes to information about the virus. We see that in discussions about mask mandates, about school and business closures, and really about almost every public policy decision that could be made around the pandemic. There are multiple reasons for this distrust. One is that, as I've noted, the science around the virus has been so intensely politicized, and that there has been such a rabid spread of misinformation and conspiracy thinking. But another reason for that distrust relates to the public's confusion surrounding the virus itself. Because the pace of research on the virus has been so fast and the scientific debates around it are so visible, it's easy for people to come away with the sense that maybe scientists just can't make up their minds, or that they're hypocrites, or that this process is somehow fundamentally untrustworthy. And so one of the most important challenges for science journalists is to not only report the results of the science they're covering, but to find ways to show how science works, to drive home that it's an incremental process and that it's normal for scientific understanding of any topic to shift over time, to show that uncertainty is a normal part of science. One important way of doing that is by revealing in full color the people behind the research, by asking questions like, how do scientists know what they know? And what do they still not know? And what drives them to do what they do? What keeps them awake at night? What has caused them to change their minds? An example of a story that I admired that did this very well was a Scientific American profile that Jane Chu wrote last spring about the Chinese virologist Shizheng Li of the Wuhan Institute of Virology. Last winter, she led the race to track down the origins of this mysterious new virus. In that story, Chu showed in an action-driven, close-up way what had brought Xi to that point, what was in her mind when she learned about possible human cases of the new coronavirus, and what it was like to be at the epicenter of this crisis as it began in China. The goal in this kind of work is to shed light on science as a human endeavor. And when science journalists are able to do that, I think they equip their readers to think about the scientific process as just that, a process. In the context of covering the coronavirus, one reason that's important is because having that kind of understanding is a sort of inoculation against dangerous misinformation that costs lives. Thank you very much.